And I thought it would be fun to share some kind of like high-level reflections on like what we're trying to achieve here and what are the impediments to achieving it. So I guess we're all on the same page that many of the problems that we're interested in solving are collective action problems, right? Doesn't matter. Pick your favorite horseman of the apocalypse, and it's guaranteed to be traceable in some way to a collective action problem. And we've already done some taxonomizing this morning in terms of thinking about the solution space, and that was there was one room for the problem for the solution on the left, and another room for the solution on the right in our breakout sessions this morning. So, we think of how AI might change this landscape as both AI can help people deliberate better or come to better solutions amongst themselves, but an alternative is that we might just have multi-agent systems that solve the problems for us, right? So full delegation. So what are the problems? Well, this is my sort of, this is a compilation of notes I made this morning after listening to everyone speaking, and trying to think about like if we're serious about this endeavor, either of those two endeavors, what are the hurdles that we need to overcome in order to get there? And this is my sort of six-fold taxonomy of the problems. First of all, we need to know what is the substrate through which this is actually going to be enacted. Is this just words? Is this words and actions? Is it resource allocation? Is it something else? Alignment. Alan gave us this really nice kind of like vertical versus horizontal kind of division, and alignment is kind of a bit different from cooperation. I totally buy into that. But all forms, whether you're talking about mediation or delegation, there's still a big alignment problem. And I would argue that the alignment problem is actually much bigger than it is in the single agent case. Incentives, like if people are involved in this process, we need to incentivize them to participate. Scale, over what scale does collective action or collective deliberation happen? Should it happen at the local level? If we take the promise of AI to scale it massive seriously, what are the implications of that? We don't know because that social experiment hasn't happened yet. Trust. How do we establish legitimacy of outcomes? And that's both informally and through formal mechanisms like legal infrastructure. And then power, of course, like the challenge of, or the opportunity of cooperative AI comes along with the risk of collusive AI, and collusive AI might actually contribute to rather than solving this problem of gradual disempowerment that was mentioned this morning. And I think that the interesting thing is that almost without exception, we don't have to solve these problems from scratch. And the reason is that in trying to solve these problems, we can inherit an enormous, rich body of intellectual history which has tried to solve these problems in the human-to-human case. Each one of these issues is, of course, fundamental to thinking about how to organize society. So, of course, on the one hand, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we shouldn't. I think that computer scientists are the most guilty people in the world for wheel reinvention, because like they don't read anything other than archive papers. And so on the one hand, we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. On the other hand, there is a qualitative shift, right? And for me, the best way to describe that shift is that we are moving from a world that is primarily rules-based to a world that is primarily optimization-based. And what I mean by that is, rather than being guided by principles which are articulable with sentences, we are, for example, in legal documents, we're moving to a world, or hard and fast rules-based processes like those that you encounter when you, I don't know, are subject to two-factor authentication or something like that. We're moving to a world in which optimization determines our interactions with the rest of society. Optimization meaning basically with AI trained with gradient descent. Okay, so I'm just going to go through briefly a few reflections on some of these some of these challenges. So thinking about the substrate, of course, the simple answer to this question is that of what is the substrate is that we should just stick to natural language, right? And Michiel talked about our project this morning, the Habermas machine, and this is what we do in the Habermas machine, right? So we just train a model to try and come up with natural language solutions to problems. But of course, the problem here is that maybe we're not actually achieving very much here, right? We know that natural language solutions sound nice, but how are they actually put into practice? Who interprets that and puts them into practice? And there's always a risk that, you know, we just like go through some sort of theater of democracy rather than actually building something that can bring about meaningful change. Maybe we want systems that actually take actions. Now we have the opportunity. We have AI agents. They're bad, but they're here, and they're going to get better. So what action should we afford those systems to take for our collective benefit? And how do we decide that process? How do we even decide what is in and out of scope? So I think these are dramatically unsolved problems. Talk a little bit about alignment. So, you know, of course, like the obvious solution, we have LLMs. So if you want to do, for example, mediation in human deliberation, there's an obvious way to tackle it, which is just to prompt the model and say, please be a nice mediator. And that, I'm fairly sure you can all agree, is probably not going to work very well because of the inherent biases in the model and so on. So we probably need to inherit some of the technologies that we've already built, some of the solutions that we've already built. So when we worked on the Habermas machine, we did exactly this, and we imported ideas from social choice theory to essentially run an election between different candidate statements and building on kind of principles that have strong guarantees over social choice. So that's one. We can introduce tooling that we've already built to try and improve the opportunities for alignment. But what worries me deeply is the idea that as we move towards fuller and fuller delegation, this alignment problem really gets really hard. And the reason why it gets hard is because if you think about the personal AI paradigm, which, let's face it, that is the dominant paradigm for all of the major tech companies right now. We're going to sell you personal AI that does stuff on your behalf. Then if that stuff involves interacting with social others who are also using a personal AI, then we have the opportunity to create a reciprocal dynamic which ends up at an equilibrium which is far removed from what we would have arrived at had we debated or decided by ourselves, and might be deeply disaffecting. Incentives. So I think there's two meanings of incentives here. Currently, we've built some tools, again, like the Habermas machine, Polis is another example, that I think are good solutions to low-stakes problems. So by low-stakes problems, I mean, you know, you can chat about stuff, and there's an idea that comes out the other end that might be useful, facilitated by AI. But how do we scale to problems that are fully incentive compatible? Like, you know, actually having meaningful intervention in the discussions that happen at COP every year over climate negotiations. And there's another meaning of incentives, and that's like participation. So if we want this to work seriously at scale, we need people to invest time. How do you encourage people to invest time? Part of the problem is that talking about politics is both incredibly interesting and incredibly boring. And it tends to be incredibly interesting in all the wrong forums, like when you're preening on Twitter. And it tends to be less interesting in all the right forums, like when you're contributing to, for example, a citizens' assembly. So there's a psychological question of how we create structures, mechanisms that will encourage good faith participation. Scale. So I've said this really already, but my assumption is that in a pluralistic society in which there's kind of spatially autocorrelated perspectives in geographical space, then probably we need local solutions. And the question is, how big or how small should these solutions be? If AI allows us to scale, even to scale up to the level of debate at whole citizen bodies in nation states, what does this actually buy us? Maybe the solutions that come out the other end aren't good for a pluralistic society like the UK, where everyone in the north thinks differently to everyone in the south. Trust. So I'm not an expert here, and there are experts in the room, but like establishing legitimacy of outcomes, I think, is perhaps the biggest challenge for us. In a rules-based world, rules are legible. You can say them out loud. They can be written down. But what happens in an optimization-based world? I mean, I was struck by Alan's challenge that maybe we could write down a constitution in 10 words. my assumption is that language is too blunt an instrument to encapsulate the full richness of the policies that we need in order to have good, positive solutions for collective action. But then if you're going to learn a complex manifold then to solve those problems, then of course it's going to be very hard to explain. On the formal side, of course, we need new legal infrastructures for things like liability. And Gillian, for example, has written a lot about that. And we also, I'm sure, need rules to layer on top of the optimization-based systems, which is what people like Alan, who now I can't see, Chan, have written a lot about. Things like identity binding, licensing, and many other solutions. And with power, I mean, maybe I'll just end rather than, well, maybe I'll just say, my view is that what technology fundamentally does is it shifts power from individuals to organizations. And I think that this is something that we have to grapple with in the context of AI. The chances are that AI will end up empowering large groups, and of course we already see this in the context of the developers and governments, who I've at various points in my career represented both. And the question is, how can we avoid this really creating significant externalities? And then, as we've mentioned many times, there is this notion of technological determinism. As AI becomes part of our everyday lives, we're going to get lock-in or a failure to be able to reverse the disempowerment that it includes. And I'll just end with this figure. So I really like the metaphor, which is given, I think it's owes to Glenn Whale, who says that with AI, we have to navigate what Daron Acemoglu has called the narrow corridor. And in Acemoglu's case, it's between authoritarianism and anarchy. But with AI, we have the same navigation between chaos and what he calls the singularity, but not the singularity in the sense of AGI, but singularity in the sense of all power being concentrated in one bucket. And so I think for multi-agent, the big challenge is how to avoid that, those two extreme poles. Thank you.